Somewhere inside of us, there's someone who knows why we're here. It's inside everyone. We might say that it's not a single entity that knows. It is all the parts, all the spirits, all the forces together that know. Every part has their piece that helps realize the message. This is why when we think about it at any given time, some of the parts might actually be activated already. They might tell us pieces, and yet we can't know the meaning of those pieces until the other pieces get released. Life is not a human enterprise, which means that even though our mind is used to mistakes, oversights, conflicts, different beings having different opinions and wanting to go on different courses, life is not like this at all. Life at its source is completely unified. All the parts were created perfectly to fit together on all dimensions. There is a power that is autonomous within this structure that can do on its own accord, and that force, that power, is causing a lot of confusion. But the framework within which it operates is perfectly sound. All movement has the perfect reaction coming from the source. And so when we were created, we weren't created so that we have to guess, or that we have to wonder, or that we have to question why we were created. We were created so that intrinsically we know, just like we know many things about how to interact with reality that nobody really taught us. We just know because it's within our nature to know. This is how we can relate to each other. Because we know certain things, even though we cannot explain how we know them or from where we know them. And so in a balanced reality, this knowledge also includes the reason, the purpose, the way in which we were expected to interact. We, the autonomous power, the human spirit. So inside of us is lots of information, important information. Not in the form of information, in the form of spiritual reality, in this form of being. And yet all being is information, because being means being a specific way and not being all the other ways. Any form of being, and there's already discrimination. about what this being is. The source is beyond being. The source is the one who gives being. And within being, when the source gives being, within that being, the source gives all that is necessary for that being to complete its natural process. That includes everything it needs in the environment to be prepared for it. Its food, its shelter, the proper temperature for its existence, the proper cycles of the stars, the cycles of the seasons, the cycles of the day, everything prepared so that when the creature receives being, this being justifies itself in all dimensions, in all forms and aspects. And so there can be no lack. There can be no lack of knowledge, no lack of information, no lack of instruction. Any lack, and that would indicate something within the source that is lacking. Perfect source, perfect production. And so somehow this imbalance that we're experiencing is not in the source. This imbalance is not considered an imbalance from his perspective. This imbalance is simply an imbalance from our perspective. We don't appreciate the interaction that we are having with reality. Reality is giving us exactly what we're asking for. And so in this sense, reality is perfect. Reality is reacting to us perfectly. That makes reality perfect. We, on the other hand, are not perfect. We're not perfect because we're not consciously aware of what we really want. We're not really inviting what we want. We're inviting something else, and then we complain. We can't invite what we haven't even defined or understood, simply because we believe that what we're inviting is going to be better for us doesn't mean that it really is better for us. It doesn't mean that we're inviting it based on how reality was meant to be invited. And so we're inviting something because we're interacting with reality, but we don't understand the nature of this conversation. And so when things come, it seems to us that they have no relation to what we invited, and yet we're getting exactly what we invited. And something inside of us knows the entire trail of what we invited and what we received in return. Something inside of us is extremely intelligent. It never loses track of the math of what's supposed to happen next. And how do we know? Because something always happens next. So someone is keeping track of what needs to happen next. And then the next thought arises, the next feeling arises, something is calculating and arriving to conclusions every single moment. And beyond every someone, that we're aware of are many someones we're not aware of, and they're all there. Just because a part of your being is conscious doesn't mean that the other parts are gone. They're all there. Now we're conscious of this aspect, and now we're conscious of another aspect. Now we see this mood, and now we see the other mood, and yet all of them are always there. All of them are always active. They're always involved in what's taking place. And then there are those that are beyond perception. We don't experience them now. We don't experience them on different days, and yet they're always there because they're not visible. They're in the background. They're experiences that affected us so deeply that we didn't even realize that there was any change. The change was not perceivable. The change was in those lenses that are before perception. All of them are active. When we're looking at anything, all of them are active. Otherwise, we wouldn't know the first thing we're looking at. We're looking through many lenses. Therefore, what we're looking at receives all kinds of meaning. Our lenses are animating the events of our lives and making them spiritual, creating a spirit based on the events. And so the forces know. And yet, because there is no balance, the forces cannot tell us. They're telling us, but they're not telling us the truth. Everyone is receiving information from the forces, but that information is based on very specific circumstances and therefore is not meaningful beyond those circumstances. Only when the forces are concerned with the deeper reality can the lens become more pure, more transparent. So we can perceive the truth. We can perceive what the forces are really trying to say. How and where are they out of balance? How and where can we receive more from them if we know how to interact with them appropriately? This is the truth that is always true. The forces are always talking. And yet, it's not prophecy unless the forces are being received accurately. The message is being translated accurately. Any interest within the soul that is not aligned with reality, and the message of the forces is going to be contaminated by something that is less than the full truth. Something that serves an immediate interest rather than the ultimate interest. So in order for that something or someone that knows to be able to communicate with the one that's aware, all the forces need to unite. Any force that's not united with the rest of the forces, with all of reality, is causing an imbalance in the message, causing an imbalance in the behavior, causing an imbalance in the moods. Everything because reality is not being reflected in that mind. The thoughts are being tilted to something other than the truth. And therefore, there's an imbalance. There's going to be consequences. The body is going to have consequences. The mind is going to have consequences. And then we might look to resolve these consequences in all the wrong places. We might blame all kinds of dogmatic beliefs or things that we believed are wrong with us decades ago. We might blame those things because we have no real way of telling what's being offended and what's causing the imbalance. The unity is the place where all the forces come back to realizing that they're part of a whole, that it's within their best interest to get along. It's within the interest of every single one of your thoughts to align with what's best for you, because your thoughts have no life other than you. They have no life, they have no existence outside of you. And so if you don't have the ability to think properly, your thoughts lose out. So it's within your thoughts' best interest to heal you, so that it can become stronger and healthier. And so with all the rest of the forces, everything that's happening inside of you is a part of you, and you're making it happen, which means it, at its core, has your best interest at heart. And so any form of conflict between the forces comes from some form of a lie, some form of a misrepresentation, some form of misunderstanding. And the same goes for our relationship with the collective, each individual. The way it relates to the collective, if the individual understood the relationship appropriately, it would only have the collective's best interest at heart, because it knows that it can receive no life other than through the collective. If the collective is weakened, the individual gets weakened. And so it's within the best interest of the individual to strengthen the collective. If the individual is against the collective, then there's been some form of misunderstanding. The information hasn't been powerful enough to allow the truth to reign supreme. And therefore, the parts are turning away from the whole. This means the whole will suffer, of course, and so will the parts, who are nothing other than parts of a whole. this form of experience where the parts inside of us cannot speak to our consciousness is called tardema, a deep slumber. It's like a form of hibernation. This hibernation is a survival mode. It's what happens when the spirit has perceived the reality that it absolutely cannot live with. It goes into hibernation. The forces, in order to allow the being to experience whatever is available that is offensive, will discontinue their communication to the conscious mind. The conscious mind is going to create its own story for now, without any guidance, because the appropriate guidance would be too much for the spirit to digest. So there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between what's really being experienced and what's being perceived. What's being perceived is in one reality, what's being experienced is in another reality. This is called tardema. Wherever there is conflict, wherever there is violence, there is tardema. Violence is one of the symptoms of tardema. When there is no communication, then the nervous energy that's happening in the experience doesn't get the proper release, because the one perceiving is in charge, and the one perceiving doesn't know what it's experiencing. It's not aware, it's not conscious. And so what's going to happen with all that energy that the experience is generating and the perception is denying? All that energy is going to start looking for an explanation within perception. And perception is going to find someone to blame in order to justify all that energy that's boiling up inside of it. And then perception is going to retaliate. It's going to direct all the negative energy at the artificial target. The target is artificial because perception wasn't tuned into experience. Perception doesn't really know who the culprit is. We know. The real culprit is perception. Perception separated from reality, therefore he doesn't know. And therefore he's blaming. And so to awaken is to return. To return is to unite. To unite is to allow the forces to communicate to perception. Perception is one of the forces. Perception is a force that can also turn away from the collective. When perception turns away from the collective, it becomes weaker and weaker. And what does weaker look like? More and more distant from reality, more and more delusional. More and more believing its own story, even though reality is screaming otherwise. What we experience is the true interpretation of our heart. What we perceive is the story we're telling ourselves. What we perceive can easily be tampered with. What we experience comes directly from the source. What we experience still needs to be interpreted by perception. And so even though we know that experience is right where perception is wrong, it doesn't mean that now we know, because perception is still wrong. Who is interpreting experience? Perception. We can't avoid perception. We can't follow experience directly because experience doesn't speak. Experience is not an interpretation. Experience gives no guidance to the future. And so at the end of the day, it's still perception that we're dealing with, even if we know. It just means that perception has to realize that it serves reality. It needs to remember that commitment so it doesn't become an enemy of reality. So perception, when it returns to serving reality, to serving the source that made it perceive, then the forces can express themselves within perception, just like they're expressing themselves within reality, within experience. The forces are always expressing themselves within experience. But not all forces are properly represented in perception. For most of us, there's not a single force that's properly represented in perception. Each one is either overstimulated or understimulated because there was no one paying attention. It just happened randomly based on external influences. So this unity allows perception to rise to the highest places within the soul, because it allows all the forces to be the way that they are, and then it can see them. As long as perception is directing, it doesn't see. It's talking so much that it never listens. When it listens, it learns. When it doesn't talk, it's learning, it's observing. Reality continues, and now perception becomes attuned to reality. And in this place, all the knowledge within the spirits, all the unconscious information, all the lenses that we were looking through, they all become conscious, they all become a part of awareness. And this is the real nature of what creates reality. And therefore, when we can see more, we're more in tune with reality automatically. When we can perceive what is as it is, because it's happening right inside of us, then we can align with what is. Then we can know. Then we can know our purpose. We can know what we were meant to be doing based on what's inside of us. That's the only place it would ever be written. And this brings us closer to the ultimate unity. The ultimate unity is the one that knows all parts, all forces, all lenses. Nothing blocks his vision. Nothing is behind him. Everything is in front of him, and he understands it all. The closer we are to his perspective, the more we align with him. The more the natural affinity between the two parties grows. Until there's a unification. Unification is the beginning of prophecy. Prophecy is the accurate representation of the forces. So that they can explain to us what they're doing to us. And the prophet will translate that message to our mindset so that we can relate. The prophet can have access to the divine perspective and then later come back to the human perspective and translate the divine message. Except for Moshe, who could have access to the divine perspective and the human perspective at the same time and translate live. And so the nature of the truth is in all of us. Prophecy is in all of us. The message delivered accurately. For that we have to prepare. That's not natural to us today. It will be. Hopefully in the very near future. But for now, it requires a process of cleansing ourselves from the illusions that misinterpret the forces that are conveying the divine message.